Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Imagine walking into a large lecture hall. The air is stale, smelling of floor wax and old paper. You find a seat in the middle row, open a fresh notebook, and look up at the professor. It is Psychology 101. Over the course of the semester, you are going to learn how the human mind works. And if you are like millions of students over the last 50 years, you are going to learn two very specific, very famous stories. They are the parables of our dark nature. The first story tells us that we are indifferent. It takes us to a street in Queens, New York, in the dead of night. A woman screams for help while 38 of her neighbors watch from their windows, safe and warm, doing absolutely nothing to save her. It is the story that gave us the bystander effect, the proof that in a crowd we lose our humanity. The second story tells us that we are cruel. It takes us to a basement at Stanford University. A group of nice, middle-class college boys are divided into guards and prisoners. Within days, the guards become sadistic monsters, and the prisoners broken victims, proving that evil lurks inside all of us, just waiting for the right situation to let it out. These stories are powerful. They are dramatic. They have shaped laws, police training, and our fundamental understanding of who we are. They tell us that deep down, civilization is a thin veneer over a core of apathy and malice. But I want you to pause. Hold that heavy textbook in your mind. Imagine hearing a sudden, sharp screech like a needle dragging across a vinyl record. Because here is the problem. Those stories, the ones printed in bold text and recited by experts for decades, are not the whole truth. In fact, they are barely truths at all. What if the 38 witnesses didn't just watch? What if the sadistic guards were following a script? Today, we are going to peel back the layers of the two most famous case studies in psychology. We are going to find out how a sensational newspaper editor and a fame-seeking professor distorted reality to sell us a version of humanity that is darker, simpler, and much more marketable than the truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Let us begin in the early morning hours of March 13, 1964. We are in Kew Gardens, a quiet, leafy neighborhood in Queens, New York. It is the kind of place people move to for peace and quiet. The protagonist of this tragedy is Kitty Genovese, known to everyone as Kitty. She is 28 years old, independent, and full of life. She manages a bar, drives a red Fiat, and is heading home after a late shift. The story we have been told, the one that ran on the front page of the New York Times 2 weeks later, goes like this. Kitty parks her car at the train station lot, just 100 feet from her apartment door. As she walks toward the building, a man named Winston Moseley attacks her. He stabs her. She screams. She screams loudly, crying out that she has been stabbed, begging for help. According to the narrative, lights flickered on in the apartment building known as Mowbray House. Windows slid open. Silhouettes appeared. The attacker, spooked by the lights, ran away. Kitty, bleeding, dragged herself toward the safety of her building. But then silence. The lights went off. The windows closed. Nobody came down. Nobody called the police. Seeing that no one was coming to help, the attacker returned. He found Kitty slumped in a hallway at the back of the building. He attacked her again, and this time he killed her. The New York Times headline that followed changed the world. It read, 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The number was later updated to 38. The article, written by Martin Gansberg but driven by the powerful Metropolitan editor A.M. Rosenthal, painted a chilling picture of moral decay. It wasn't just a murder. It was an indictment of urban life. Rosenthal wrote a book about it called 38 Witnesses, turning the number 38 into a symbol of collective shame. Psychologists scrambled to explain it. They coined the term diffusion of responsibility. The idea was that because so many people were watching, everyone assumed someone else would call the cops, so nobody did. It became the ultimate proof that modern society alienates us from one another. We became a nation terrified of the watching eyes that do not see. But decades later, people started pulling at the threads of this perfectly constructed tragedy. One of them was Kitty's own brother, Bill Genovese. He couldn't reconcile the sister he knew with the lonely death described in the papers. He, along with amateur historians and tenacious journalists, went back to the police logs. They went back to the architecture of Kew Gardens, and the story they found was radically different. Let us look at the geography first. The story implies a courtyard where everyone had a front row seat to the entire event. That is false. The attacks happened in two different locations. The first attack happened on Austin Street. While there were apartments overlooking the street, it was 3 a.m. on a freezing cold night. Most windows were closed tight. When the attacker first struck, Kitty did scream, but she didn't necessarily scream words that were clear to waking sleepers. One witness, a man named Robert Moser, did open his window. He shouted at the attacker to leave the girl alone, and it worked. The attacker ran away. This is a crucial detail often left out of the myth. A bystander did intervene. His shout saved her from the initial assault. Kitty, injured but alive, then staggered around the corner of the building to a vestibule area, completely out of sight of the street and those initial windows. This is where the timeline gets muddy. The attacker returned about 10 minutes later. He hunted for her and found her trapped in that back hallway. The people who might have seen or heard the first attack physically could not see the second one. The layout of the complex blocked the view. The idea of 38 people watching a 20-minute murder like spectators in a coliseum is geographically impossible. Now, what about the police? The myth says nobody called. The reality is far more frustrating. We know now that several people did call. But in 1964, there was no 911 system. You had to dial 0 for an operator or call the local precinct directly. Calls were often routed to a central desk where bored or overwhelmed officers took notes. One witness, a man named Michael Sacco, called the police to report a woman being beaten. The police didn't dispatch a car. Another neighbor called, but the details were vague, and it was logged as a domestic disturbance, a lower priority. The system failed, not the neighbors. But the most heartbreaking omission from the Standard story is the presence of Sophia Farrar. Sophia was Kitty's friend and neighbor. She lived in the complex. When she heard the commotion, she didn't just look out the window. She didn't turn up the radio. She ran out of her apartment. She ran into the night, unaware if the killer was still there. Sophia found Kitty in the hallway moments after the attacker fled. She cradled Kitty in her arms. She screamed for someone to call the police. Kitty Genovese did not die alone. She died in the arms of a friend who risked her life to help her. So why do we know the story of the 38 silent witnesses and not the story of the brave Sophia Farrar? Because A.M. Rosenthal, the Times editor, had a narrative he wanted to sell. He was obsessed with the idea that the city was losing its soul. When the police commissioner offhandedly mentioned that witnesses hadn't come forward quickly enough, Rosenthal seized on it. He assigned a reporter to make that the angle. When the reporter found inconsistencies, when he found out that some people claimed they did call, or that they couldn't see anything, Rosenthal allegedly told him to ignore it. The story was too good to check. The number 38 was catchy. It stuck. It sold papers, and it sold a worldview. The bystander effect is a real psychological phenomenon, valid in certain contexts, but the case study that founded it, the bedrock of that theory, is a fabrication. The neighbors were confused, sleepy, and hampered by poor visibility, but they were not monsters. The silence of the 38 was a ghost story invented by a newsroom. Now, let us shift gears. If the Genovese story taught us that we are passively indifferent, our next myth teaches us that we are actively malevolent. It is 1971. We are in Palo Alto, California. A young psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo wants to study the psychology of imprisonment. He creates a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford psychology department. He recruits 24 healthy, psychologically stable male college students. He flips a coin to divide them. Half will be guards, half will be prisoners. The simulation is scheduled to run for 2 weeks. The guards are given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses to hide their eyes, and wooden batons. The prisoners are arrested at their homes by real police, stripped, searched, and given numbers. The story goes that Zimbardo stepped back and let human nature take its course. And what happened was terrifying. Almost immediately, the guards began to torment the prisoners. They forced them to clean toilets with their bare hands. They put bags over their heads. They stripped them naked as punishment. The prisoners, in turn, broke down. They screamed, they cried, they became passive zombies. One prisoner, Douglas Corpy, had a screaming fit of rage and hysteria so severe he had to be released after just 36 hours. The experiment was stopped after only 6 days because it had spiraled out of control. Zimbardo's conclusion was clear. The situation is more powerful than the individual. Put good people in a bad place, give them a little power, and they will become tyrants. It is a grim assessment of the human condition. It suggests that the Nazis, the Gulag guards, the torturers of history are not anomalies. They are us, waiting for the right uniform. For decades, the Stanford Prison Experiment was the most famous study in psychology. It was illustrated in every textbook. It inspired movies. But in 2018, the archives of the experiment were finally opened to researchers, and a French author named Thibault Letexier, along with other journalists, started listening to the tapes. Yes, there were tapes. And what those tapes reveal is that the Stanford Prison Experiment was not an experiment at all. It was a play, and Philip Zimbardo was not an objective observer. He was the director. The myth relies on the idea that the guards came up with the cruelty on their own, but the archive shows Zimbardo and his assistants actively coaching the guards. Before the experiment began, there was an orientation meeting. Zimbardo told the guards that their goal was to create a sense of powerlessness in the prisoners. He told them explicitly to be tough. One of the most famous sadistic guards was a student named Dave Eshelman. He affected a Southern accent, modeled after a character from the movie Cool Hand Luke. He was nicknamed John Wayne by the prisoners. In the standard narrative, Eshelman is the prime example of how power corrupts. But in interviews years later, Eshelman admitted he was just acting. He was a drama student. He thought he was helping the researchers get the results they wanted. He was improvising a villain because he thought that was his job description. He wasn't intoxicated by power. He was trying to be a good employee. Even more damning is the story of the prisoner breakdown. Remember Douglas Corpy, the student who screamed and raged until he was released. That moment is often played in psychology classes as the sound of a human mind snapping under pressure. But if you listen to the full, unedited interviews with Corpy, the story falls apart. Corpy didn't have a psychotic break. He was faking it. Why? Because he wanted to study. Corpy had signed up for the experiment, thinking he could sit in a cell and study for his GREs to get into grad school. When the guards took his books away, he realized he was wasting his time. He asked to leave. Zimbardo said no. Think about that. A participant in a volunteer study asked to withdraw, and the researcher said no. That is a violation of every ethical code in the book. Feeling trapped and worried about his exam, Corpy decided to act crazy to force them to release him. He admitted later, "I was just trying to get out so I could go study." The screaming fit wasn't a reaction to prison trauma. It was a performance by a student who wanted to get back to his textbooks. Zimbardo didn't just observe the cruelty, he demanded it. When guards were too soft, he took them aside and chided them for not being tough enough on the dangerous prisoners. He created a pressure cooker where the only way to please the authority figure, Zimbardo himself, was to act like a monster. The irony is thick. The study claimed to prove that situations control behavior, and in a way, it did. But the situation wasn't a prison turning men into beasts. The situation was a flawed scientist pressuring students to role-play stereotypes in exchange for $15 a day. The data from the experiment was cherry-picked. Many guards refused to be cruel. They played cards with the prisoners. They were nice, but Zimbardo didn't focus on them. They didn't fit the narrative. He focused on the ones who followed his stage directions. So, where does this leave us? We have peeled back the layers of two massive pillars of modern psychology. We found that the 38 silent witnesses were actually a mix of confused neighbors, ignored callers, and a brave friend. We found that the sadistic prison guards were actually coached undergrads acting out a script for a demanding professor. Why does this matter? Why should we care if a story from 1964 or 1971 is exaggerated? It matters because the stories we tell about ourselves become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we are taught that humans are naturally apathetic, we might be less likely to intervene because we think, well, nobody else does. If we are taught that we are naturally sadistic, we might excuse abusive behavior in our institutions as inevitable human nature, rather than a failure of leadership and accountability. The myth of the bystander effect and the Stanford Prison Experiment offers us a dark comfort. It allows us to be cynical. It is easy to say, people are terrible, and wash our hands of it. It is much harder to look at the specific failures of a police dispatch system, or the unethical manipulation of a scientist, or the sensationalism of a newspaper editor. The truth is messier than the myth. The truth is that people are not programmed robots of evil or apathy. In Kew Gardens, people tried to help. In the Stanford basement, people tried to resist the cruelty until they were coerced. We are not destined to be the silent neighbor or the brutal guard. Those were roles written for us by people selling a story. And now that we know the script is fake, we have the freedom to write a better one. So the next time you hear someone say that human nature is fundamentally dark, that when the chips are down, we will turn on each other or look away, remember Kitty Genovese in the arms of Sophia Farrar. Remember Douglas Corpy just wanting to study for his exams. The half-truth is that we are monsters. The whole truth is that we are complicated, flawed, and often surprisingly decent, provided we aren't being manipulated by someone trying to prove otherwise. And that is a reality worth believing in. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.